You know what? I've actually completely changed my mind about audio modeling. Well, not entirely, but quite a bit. But what is audio modeling, and do you need it? Let's take a deeper look into that. Hi there, this is Sam with Second Tier Sound. Really nice to see you here. So let's get right down to it. What is audio modeling? Well, the way I look at it, let's think of a normal virtual instrument, like a string library. That usually consists of a bunch of recordings or samples that you trigger by hitting a key on your keyboard. And that works quite well. It sounds quite realistic. Now, in comes audio modeling. And that is an idea that doesn't use any samples at all. It creates a sound from scratch with your computer, just like a synthesizer does. Until recently, I didn't think this worked so well. I like the concept, but it just still sounds too digital, too synthesy, if that's the word. But I was fortunate to try out a bunch of different instruments by a company that is actually called Audiomodeling. And they have these instruments referred to as SWAM, acoustic sounding real instruments that have no samples in them whatsoever. So you might say, hold on, did they give you those instruments? Can I then trust this review? Well, I'm not sponsored by anyone, and I'm allowed to say whatever I want about these instruments. So my aim here is to not just review, but also to show you the real interesting concept and potential these instruments have, and to show you if they might be something for you or not. So let's get down to it. Let's take a look at the instrument first, just to show you how powerful it is. This is not just a sample player, this is a synthesizer, and you have so much more control. Now, most of what you need is here, but just to overwhelm you slightly, I want to show you that you can control so much more. How you do the expression, the vibrato, and how you vibrato, and the growl and mute control. You can do it in different play modes here. We're going to talk a little bit about this later. You can have different mutes, how the valves are being controlled, the legato priority, the timbre, very important one, because you can now change the instrument so it sounds differently, which might be very useful when you have sections, for example. The pitch, you can also see what master tune is, which is extremely useful, especially if you work with real musicians, because they might not tune, they might not play in 440, for example, which is quite hard to do with sample instruments. You also have advanced here, which is interesting, and I mentioned this later. You can have an anti-phase if you have problems with phasing, different pan-pot types, release time, dynamic pitch, so on. Quite a bit here, different vibrato style. You can also go into effects here, and they actually have a nice compressor, which is very transparent, a EQ that you can change in order to really change your sound. So it's not just a sample library. You have a whole instrument that you can tune and pitch and tweak to your heart's content, which is quite fantastic. But let's look a little bit at these controls before we listen to the sound here. One thing that is worth to mention is the pitch bend, because in most sample libraries, I would never use the pitch bend because it's just, bending the sample and it doesn't sound good. In this case, it's actually programmed, so it will be a real fall the way the instrument would do it. So if I, for example, just have a note here and go down, if you listen carefully, you will hear that it's not just bending the sound, it's actually sort of playing a fall like a real French horn player would do. You hear it? It's like that. That wouldn't be possible with a normal sample library. So, yay, you can use the pitch wheel again. Then, otherwise, these controls here are normal. You can control with your keyboard or a breath controller, which I will use later, and I will show you exactly how I will do that. Now, let's look at some controls here that are really interesting. You might see this shape here. What is that? Well, this has to do with the mute. A French horn often has a mute, either with a hand or other mutes that you put in the bell here. And you can change. This is a normal hand mute and then none. And then you can change to the other sounds later. And you can also change how close and far you want it to be. Very nice. You can also change the breath sound, how much breath you want in there. It's quite subtle, but it does make a difference. And depending on the style and genre, this can be really cool to play with. Then we have growl and flutter tongue. Flutter tongue is when you do like that in the mouthpiece. So, and growl is similar, but just a little bit more nasty sound, good for those low notes, for example. There you go. All right, we're gonna look at the instrument, how it sounds more later. Then we have pipe models, which is very interesting because all the brass ones have this. Otherwise, the interface, by the way, is pretty much the same on all the instruments, more or less. We have pipe model, and you can actually change all the brass instruments to behave like a trombone, which I think it's funny. So then it will change the notes more like a trombone will. It's quite fun, especially with the trumpets. Then we have the pipe gesture, and this has to do with the valves, how they are pressed on the brass instrument. And you might not know this if you haven't played any of the brass instruments, but depending on how quickly you press those valves down, you get sort of different transitions, almost like a legato sound, you can say. So this is the normal one, like. But if I have the half valve transition, it's quite subtle. It's just a little looser, which might work itself to certain genres or styles or a different kind of a legato. You can also do the half valve exactly, and this is very loose. So it sounds more like a portamento almost, which also can be very useful. Yeah, and you can control this with the MIDI controllers. You can change it on the fly. Right, and down here you see what you're actually doing. So right, and as you noticed, the way I play is how I control the instrument. If I want a short sound, it can be longer. Now, I obviously have to control the expression as well to get a good result here, but just showing you I can do different shorts and I can do different legatos depending on how fast I play. So it's all in your fingers, no key switches. That's just really great. Then we have these anti-phasing, which is really good. If you have several French horns at the same time, they're obviously modeled or similarly, unless you change the timbre quite a bit. This is a quick fix to make sure there's no phasing on, which is really, really clever. Then we have pipe selection, which has to do how these valves are pressed. If you do auto, they're going to follow pretty much how a real player is doing it. And this depends on the notes and the legatos. So it just sounds very realistic if you leave it as it is. I'm not going to explain how it works, even though I play the trumpet myself, which works similarly to a French horn. But if you want to have more control, you can set this on manual, and you will see here, when I play, they won't be used, and it's the same transition. So you can now change the transition the way you want it. And then you have PAM and main volume. But there's one more thing that is quite important here, and that is MIDI. You go in here, and now you can select what you want to control here. And all the green things are the ones that I'm controlling here, because I find that more interesting, basically. But you can change that yourself, for example, with different controllers. All right, so that is pretty much the interface. It changes a little bit depending on the instruments, but you will recognize immediately on all instruments. So now let's listen to a few of the instruments so you get an idea of what this sounds like. So I just wanted to mention that I'm using one of these. It's a breath controller by TEC or TEC. And the reason I say this is because it's just a different level when you play with one of those. You absolutely do not need one in order to play these instruments, but they play really well together, and it's kind of a different level. It's much more fun. It feels like you're really playing the instrument. And also you can control a lot more with this and using both your hands on the keyboard. For example, you will see me move about with my head, and that's not just to look cool or to be emotional. It actually does control some effects on the instrument by tilting to the right or back, or even biting with my teeth to get some sound effects. So look out for those. So let's try to have a conclusion of all these instruments. Let's talk about the pros and cons, and let's start with the cons. And yes, it does sound like a synthesizer still at certain times, specifically some of the woodwinds and some of the strings. I feel like that needs some improvement. But it's not bad. It's not driving me crazy. I just notice it sometimes because I'm very picky. So that's something that probably will get better in the future. There are no sections, and duh, these are solo instruments, but you might feel like, oh, I want to try this chord out with the trombones. You can't. You have to play each individual line in order to get that effect. So there's more work that way. I'll talk more later why I kind of like that, though. The last thing, this might be negative for you if you like to program everything in the key editor, MIDI editor, and put everything else and tweak it. You can do that with this instrument, but it's not meant to be that way. This is a performative instrument, and I really think that is how it shines. By playing it all in with your expression, your emotion immediately, preferably with a breath control, because that really helps. You don't have to have one, but it really helps. So you might have to do a lot of takes instead and really play your lines rather than program them in. So let's talk about what I really like about this instrument. Let's start with the obvious. RAM usage, for example, it's hardly any. CPU, I haven't really paid attention because I haven't noticed anything. So somebody might know that better than me, but I haven't had any problem. The computer has never said, oops, you're using too much. No. So that's been great. I would think that this is more a CPU-intensive plugin. But on the other hand, the space on my hard drive is just a joke. All these instruments combined take less than 500 megabytes. And just think about most of my sample libraries. I mean, they take from 20 gigabytes up to 150 or more. Yes, there are smaller ones, but we're talking about a massive amount of more space. Also, obvious small things that you might not think about. When you've done this for a while, you start to really want to have more specific short notes, not just one, right? And most sample libraries, they have recorded one sample notes, or maybe two. But there's so many ways you can have shorter notes, a little bit less, a little bit more. And the sample libraries just get bigger and bigger if you want all that. And it's tricky to program in. You have to use key switches and all kinds of stuff. You don't have to worry about that. You just play it, the short or long you want it, and it sounds good. Because the instrument is adapting to you as you play. You have all kinds of different shorts at your fingertips. You have all kinds of different legato, slow or long, depending on how you play, fast or slow. You don't get those volume sound between legato sounds. You don't get that weird stuff that happens to some libraries. But one thing, the pitch wheel, I'll use it now. I never use my pitch wheel for my sample libraries because it just sounds weird. Unless you want a strange effect, it's not recommended because you're just bending the sample. Here, it's actually adapting. So if you have an instrument that can do sort of a fall or a pitch, it will do that with a pitch wheel. So if you haven't tried that out, if you have these libraries, then try that. It just sounds really, really good and it's fun. So the pitch wheel can now be useful. There's so many ways to tweak this library. How you use the attack, the breath, the sound of the buttons, the vibrato. I mean, there's so much under the hood. And at the beginning, it might be a little bit overwhelming. You don't need to do all that. But the good thing is that you can have a whole ensemble of one flute by just tweaking the timbre a little bit and the texture, how it sounds and all that. So you don't have the exact same instruments. The greatest thing about this, which I mentioned before, is the performance aspect. It's fun to play this. I feel like an instrumentalist, I really do. I'm really playing instrument now, and this has added an extra fun and joy to working with virtual instruments. In my case, I feel like I save a lot of time because I don't have to do all that tweaking later. But this is something you have to try, not just listen. Anyway, I really hope that was useful for you. This was not just an attempt to show, oh, this is the greatest instrument, go and buy it. No, not at all. I really want to show you why I think it's a great instrument. I only show instruments on this channel that I think are worth your time. If you need solo instruments like this, you might want to look into it. But I hope you found it useful, and if you did, hit that like button and let me know. And if you want to support me so I can create more videos like this, you can always consider becoming a patron. But comments, liking, and subscribing helps me out quite a bit as well. So until next time, make sure you create a lot of music and have a good day. Take care.